Thank you for joining us. Welcome to Business Incorporated. I'm Chimezie Obi Iwagu. On the show today, South Africa's second quarter unemployment rate rises to 27.2%. Kenya's central bank head sees 2018 economic growth at 6.2% as bank cuts its benchmark lending rates. Plus, Glencore sees big jump in cobalt supply from Congo mines. We get the show started now with the markets, and here on the African continent, the two major markets faltered at intraday. The LSE index was 0.17% down, while the JSE index was down 0.02%. Looking at all the numbers there, Egypt gained strongly by 1.25%. However, Kenya closed 0.11% down on Monday after the central bank cut its rate. And in the Middle East, it was again a mixed bag at intraday. Qatar led gains by 1.80%. Abu Dhabi was also in the positive, gaining 0.27%. On the other hand, Dubai and Saudi were down 0.32% and 0.03% each. Let's cross over to Europe. Now, stocks were mixed in early trade amid a slew of data and corporate releases. Let's feel the pulse of the markets as my colleague there in Frankfurt, Paul Breeze, standing by to talk to us. Hello, Paul. Good afternoon. Hello, Paul. Good afternoon. Well, if you're hearing me, Paul, Euro area economic growth for the second quarter of this year, and of course the inflation numbers are out with data released in France showing prices surging to 2.6% over a year in July. And what does the GDP number reveal about the Eurozone economy, and how much of these numbers are driving trading sentiments today? Well, I guess we're having issues there talking to Paul, but we'll get it resolved as soon as possible. We'll move on now to the U.S., where stock index futures fluctuated ahead of Tuesday's open as a two-day central bank policy meeting begins. At around 6 a.m. Eastern Time, Dow futures was up 3 points, indicating a flat open of 0.83 points, while Nasdaq and S&P 500 futures indicated a relatively flat to upbeat start to their respective sessions. Our earnings seasons continues with a wave of corporate earnings expected. Investors will be paying close attention to earnings from Charter Communications, Pfizer, Procter & Gamble, Arthur Daniels, Midland, Acronic, Cummins, Ralph Lauren, Steve Madden, Apple, Baidu, Cheesecake Factory, and Pandora Media. A slew of economic data is also due. Personal income, core price, and the employment cost index are due out at 8:30 a.m. Eastern Time, followed by S&P Case Shiller House Price Index at 9 a.m. Eastern Time, Chicago Purchasing Managers Index at 9:45 a.m. Eastern Time, Consumer Confidence at 10 a.m. Eastern Time, and of course the Dallas Fed's Texas Service Sector Outlook Survey will be out at 10:30 a.m. Eastern Time. The Federal Open Market Committee will commence its two-day summer meeting today, and of course the rate decisions will be announced tomorrow, Wednesday. In Asia, shares closed narrowly mixed today as investors digested the Bank of Japan's decision to keep policy steady. The Nikkei 225 moved into positive territory on the back of the Bank of Japan's policy decision. The benchmark closed higher by 0.04% at 22,553.72, despite most sectors finishing in negative territory. Meanwhile, the Kospi ended the day higher by 0.08% at 2,295.26 after trading both above and below the flat line. In Australia, the S&P ASX 200 finished the day marginally higher at 6,280.20, some 0.03% higher. And then Chinese shares ended the day in different directions following the release of official manufacturing PMI that slightly missed expectations. The Shanghai Composite tacked on 0.26%, while the Shenzhen Composite inched down by 0.02%. Well, let's get back to Europe now to talk to my colleague there, Paul. Good afternoon, Paul.
Good afternoon.
We've seen the euro area economic growth for the second quarter of this year, and of course the inflation numbers which are out with data released in France showing prices surging to 2.6% over a year in July. What does that GDP number reveal about the Eurozone economy, and how much of these numbers are driving trading sentiments today?
What these GDP numbers reveal is that in that global trade conflict, that really is a global conflict now, Europe is still doing okay, still doing good. It's not outstanding, but it's not in a bad situation. The first estimate from Eurostat for growth does show that growth has slowed to 0.3% in the second quarter. But let's not forget this is now entering the 6th year of expansion that Europe continues. And countering the GDP numbers, inflation in July was up 2.1%. The core inflation was up 1.1%. And that was more than was expected, actually. It's also more than the European Central Bank is heading for, actually. They're trying to go for 2%. The inflation was mostly spiked by energy prices, rising energy prices. Energy was up 9%.
I will sincerely apologize.
It is expected.
There. Oh, we're moving now. There's no cause for alarm as far as sustaining Nigeria's debt portfolio is concerned. Those are the assuring words coming from the Director General at the Debt Management Office, Ms. Patience Oniha, who told Channels Television today that the country would keep servicing its debt as at when due. The DMO boss also addressed the concerns around state borrowing.
Nigeria's debt is sustainable in the short, in the medium, and in the long term, to the extent that we can keep servicing the debt as and at when due. They are sustainable. And let me quickly add that, first of all, Nigeria's debt is driven by a debt management strategy. And the whole objective of having a strategy in mind is to determine in advance how you would borrow, what forms of borrowing to achieve some specific objectives. So the objectives of the debt management strategy, the principal objective is that debt should be sustainable. So for that purpose, we have a debt to GDP ratio, a total public debt to GDP ratio, and that includes the debt of the states. Okay, the second objective of the debt management strategy is to ensure that borrowing is prudent at the lowest possible cost and that the debt stock is stable. So that principle, as enshrined in the strategy, which was duly approved, is what guides our borrowing. Okay, so let's go specific. Is debt sustainable? Certainly, absolutely sustainable. And the recent publication by the Debt Management Office of the Debt Sustainability Analysis for 2017 is basically an exercise to look at the debt figures as they are now, look at the future, taking into account various statistics on revenue, on budgets, on growth, on inflation, on foreign exchange, external reserves and exchange rate, put that together and project into the next 20 years and say, what is the outcome of that? Will debt be sustainable? And we look at different scenarios. The simple one, of course, is to assume that all things remain constant. But the complex one is to say, let's assume that all the indices weaken. What would happen to debt? Is this still sustainable? And the outcome shows that it is sustainable. As would be expected, by the time you project crude oil prices at below $30 per barrel and production at only 1.4 million barrels per day, certainly your revenues wouldn't be looking so good. And the indices, the ratios in terms of debt to GDP, debt service to revenue, would weaken. So that's like looking at it extremely. Weaken, but does not mean that we're in any situation of distress or that we cannot service the debt. So that exercise is actually positive. It is an exercise that Nigeria decided to do voluntarily. It's an IMF-driven template, and we do it annually to be sure that we're not just saying it, making claims that debt is not sustainable, that everything is okay. We actually shock the figures, look 20 years ahead, to be able to advise government and reassure the public that debt is sustainable. worry is not the factor we're looking at now. Worry will be that do we have a process for ensuring that borrowing, and when I'm talking borrowing here, it's either borrowing from the bond market, borrowing from commercial banks. Is there a process to ensure that there's some control around it with the overall objective of ensuring that the debt of the state governments is sustainable? And I would say yes, there's actually a circular on our website, the website of the Debt Management Office, that prescribes the basis and the process by which subnational governments can borrow. Okay, so are most of them compliant? Are they within the threshold? Absolutely. So what that circular says, it ensures that both the executive and the legislature at the state levels are involved in that borrowing by giving their approvals. It also requires that we test their debt service. Okay, so they have debt already running for which there are debt service obligations. So for any new borrowing, we test their debt service existing and the new one, the debt service on the new one they want to take, and then check, measure that against their revenue, their average revenue for 6 months. If that ratio is higher than 40%, that approval will be declined. So there is a limit for the states, the subnationals. It is 40%. The maximum debt service is 40% to their revenue, average revenue for the preceding 6 months. And we do comply with that. And because most of them are backed by deductions from their FAC, which we call irrevocable standing payment order, which has to be given by the Honorable Minister. Before the Honorable Minister approves any new borrowing for states, that is done, including for external debt.
Patience Oniha, Nigeria's Director General of the Debt Management Office. We move over now to South Africa, where the unemployment rate rose to 27.2% of the labor force in the second quarter from 26.7% in the first quarter. In its quarterly labor force survey, Statistics South Africa said the manufacturing sector saw the most job losses. There were 6.1 million people without jobs in the 3 months to the end of June, compared with 6 million people in the first 3 months of the year. Meanwhile, the International Monetary Fund has kept South Africa's economic growth forecast for 2018 unchanged at 1.5%, but warned that the economy faced several headwinds, mainly the rapid rise in public debt and potential bailouts to state firms. Cyril Ramaphosa's election as president in February on a promise to implement reforms and root out corruption has buoyed investor confidence, although the growth outlook remains much lower than the 5% annual growth government is aiming for to make a dent in near-record unemployment. And Kenya's economy is likely to expand by 6.2% this year, and that's according to the central bank governor, offering a rosier outlook than the finance ministry, which expects growth of 5.8%. The East African economy expanded by 5.7% in the first quarter as farming, which accounts for close to a third of output, recovered from a drought in the same period a year earlier. The economy expanded by 4.9% in 2017. Patrick Njoroge, the governor, says the forecast was based on the economy's performance in the first quarter, a stronger agriculture sector, and a jump in tourist forward bookings. The central bank cut its benchmark lending rate to 9% on Monday from 9.50%, adding inflation expectations were well anchored within the target range. And Glencore PLC has increased cobalt production by almost a third after restarting output at its Katanga unit in the Democratic Republic of Congo. The Swiss commodity giant is seeking to double its production of cobalt in the next 2 years, tightening its grip on the market for the key battery material in electric vehicles. First half cobalt output jumped 31% to 16,700 tons. While Glencore is cashing in on higher cobalt and copper demand, it also must confront serious challenges this year. The U.S. Department of Justice has launched a corruption probe into operations in Congo, Nigeria, and Venezuela, and it's facing higher taxes and tougher regulations in Congo. In its production report today, Glencore maintained most of its full-year targets, with slight reductions to its coal and lead estimates. Copper output rose 8% during the first half, and nickel production increased 21%. We'll take a break and we'll be back in a moment. Stay tuned.